Disclaimer, don't harass any of the creators featured in this video. This is not a hit piece, nor is it to criticize them individually. Before we jump in, I just want to give you a warning that this video will contain pretty serious discussions of issues such as true crime, abuse, mental health, suicide, and if any of that content is harmful to you or you become uncomfortable at any point, I strongly recommend clicking out of the video and prioritizing your well-being. Additionally, some of the footage used may be disturbing to some viewers. Please be advised. The deepest recesses of our minds cannot resist the call of the unknown. It's a siren song that compels people to dive into the horrific and unusual. On one side of YouTube is horror game let's plays and creepypastas, and the other is true crime and the paranormal. So you might find it surprising that I actually really dislike the majority of horror content on YouTube. Not necessarily specific creators, but the more general lack of care put into covering topics in an intelligent and conscientious fashion that doesn't play up serious real-world issues in order to sell you on the horror of a topic. Presenting horror to entertain an audience entails dramatizing and playing up the fears and anxieties of the viewers in order to evoke shock and awe. This usually occurs with little consideration as to how ethical it is to spice certain details up. There's nothing wrong with trying to be entertaining, but it is worth interrogating the means with which people try to engage their audiences in the YouTube horror community, as well as the ethics of receiving money for doing so. True crime is one of the fastest growing genres on YouTube, and it's no stranger to controversy. I'm not really fascinated by any one channel. I'm more interested in interrogating the ethics of producing true crime content and how it's presented to an audience. I want to preface this video by saying that I'm not prescribing what content creators should or shouldn't do. Nor am I that concerned with what you as viewers consume in your spare time. You determine for yourself what you're comfortable with. This is just some thoughts on why I don't like most true crime content, even if I'm willing to sit through videos about it. Entertaining is part of a content creator's job, and there's very few people out there who make it big by being super deadpan while talking about something they're presenting to an audience. Unless of course you're built different, and you build an audience by being earnest while being funny, while being deadpan. In a sea of innumerable stars, you need to differentiate yourself and carve out your own niche. That's why so many different audiences exist on YouTube. But with that in mind, creativity underpins a lot of what content creation is about. And that doesn't necessarily mean that everything you're doing is new, but everything you make reflects some part of you. Adding a level of charm almost feels like a necessity, but I'm going to argue the opposite specifically for true crime. True crime content explores real-world crimes, generally focusing on the build-up to a murder or some type of violence. It features real criminals, real victims, and real consequences, and people tend to watch these videos to find out about cases they haven't heard of before. These videos are generally harmless if they cover things in a relatively informative and matter-of-fact way, but it's when creators get really creative, for lack of a better word, that the quality and tact in covering such sensitive topics begins to fall apart. There's nothing more jarring than hearing, and then he killed her by gouging her eyes out, followed by, I bet she didn't see that coming. What are you, a writer for the Marvel Cinematic Universe? Personally, that style of commentary leaves a bad taste in my mouth, because it's just super callous about a very serious topic.
This story takes us to the exotic locale of Pleasanton, California. Wow, naming it that, it's like they wanted something bad to happen. And it did.
I know that many true crime fans will roll their eyes and say it's sensitive or unreasonable, but true crime content concerns non-fictional tragedy and trauma, so is creativity really necessary for this genre in particular? I guess that depends entirely on your taste and the content you're willing to consume, but I know what I don't like, so I'm gonna start there. The idea of content being more palatable in some formats than others suggests that people want the visceral details of gruesome acts, but they want it presented in a way that's engaging and digestible for the average viewer, so they consume the content without feeling overly upset or bogged down by the gritty reality that they've just grappled with. But that comes at a cost. Maybe the video is less serious, maybe it's less direct, because it's framed more like a chat than a documentary-style explanation of events. And maybe you've woven jokes here and there to break up the tension of the video leading up to the awful events that eventually unfold. To understand just how strange some of the true crime formats are, let's go from standard to bizarre. Let's start with interrogation analysis, which usually entails breaking down psychological tactics in interrogations and detailed analysis of criminals' behaviors before, during, and after their arrest. This was hugely popular on YouTube because of a channel called JCS Psychology, a channel that doesn't really exist anymore because it can't monetize and all their videos have been taken down. Then we have true crime commentaries, which are usually relatively cursory, timeline until murder videos which break down the lives of the parties involved before detailing the acts of murder, violence, or whatever at the climax of the presentation. Next we have the more callous content, such as doing makeup while talking about true crime. While absolutely jarring, it only gets worse from here. Then we have true crime ASMR, which is like the regular true crime content, but whispered, I guess? I don't really know, and I'm not a fan of ASMR content in general. Not in a negative way, but I don't go out of my way to watch it, mixing the sort of soft-spoken whispering and serious nature of the subject matter, because I feel like that's kind of juvenile in my eyes, at least when it comes to true crime ASMR. Finally, we arrive at the peak of awful true crime content, which is mukbangs. Yup, eating food while talking about atrocities. Some people say it gives them a feeling of sitting down and chatting with a friend, but picture your own relative being discussed while the creator is stuffing their face with spicy sauce and fried chicken. Maybe the way they cover the content is respectful, but it's pretty hard to take any or all of that seriously. Nor does it leave with the victims with any dignity because they're reduced to a mere dinner conversation topic, which I personally think is quite demeaning. Yeah, I can't say I've seen some of the weirder ones in that list, and I'll say it straight. I think the last three are exactly what's wrong with true crime content, and the tendency to lean into the shock by using a bizarre format that reduces the gravity of the crimes to a topic you might discuss while getting Korean barbecue with some friends or something. Granted, you can do that if your friends are cool with talking about crime while eating, but it's different when you're presenting this to an audience as a public figure within earshot of people who knew the victim. Victims of crimes are not random abstract concepts that exist in a vacuum. Their lives, whether they were taken or irreparably changed, still leave behind family members and friends that can see the things you say and do with regards to the crimes perpetrated against them. I don't feel that it's unreasonable to think that we should be respectful even if the family and friends of the victim are not people that we know. I'm sure most people wouldn't want to see their dead aunt's name show up next to a thumbnail of fried chicken, right? The point isn't about virtue signaling and being more morally upright than others. The point is about how true crime content consumers have to understand that while we may divorce ourselves from the subject matter and just forget about it after the video ends, the fact remains that its fallout pervades every facet of the lives of the people around that victim. We can minimize their feelings and the moral weight that it carries, and simply argue that the message is bigger than the cost in some bizarre utilitarian sense. But that calculus is only reasonable to us because we know our curiosity for tragedy outweighs the trauma we will never feel an ounce of. They still have to hear the victim's favorite song, hear about their favorite movie, or remember making their favorite food. These are things that, as creators and consumers, we have to acknowledge and plan carefully around, because to the families, we might just be stomping all over that person's grave by trivializing and profiting from their trauma in a really callous manner. Not only that, there would likely be people on social media engaging in discourse as to whether mass murderers are also victims, and while it might be logically true in some respect in some cases, it is largely inappropriate to even weigh it on the same scale of the victims that they ended the lives of. Yeah, my rhetoric is an appeal to empathy and emotion, because the trauma endured by the friends and family are extremely personal by nature. At the end of the day, you're drawing yourself a line in the sand, and you have to carry that burden of knowing that no matter how much you try, you'll probably never be able to do justice to the victim's friends and family in the way that you cover them. And you might want to ask yourself whether that's something you can genuinely reckon with and feel comfortable with at the end of the day. That's up to you to decide as a creator and as a consumer. And so begins the tug of war of true crime, where pretty much all the content you can make is probably going to be offensive sometime or other, and at the end of the day, you're going to have to determine whether you're going to consume that, and creators, whether you're going to make that. There's a tendency to claim that true crime as a genre draws attention to cases and spreads awareness. But what exactly does making content around murder, assault, and other such topics really do? Despite many victims in true crime content being women, research suggests that women actually constitute a large proportion of the true crime audience. Some experts hypothesize that women are partially drawn to a complex mix of intrigue, such as a violent case, as well as paying careful attention to the subtle red flags given off by a charming and handsome stranger that pushes more and more boundaries before committing a really heinous act. A research report I read called Captured by True Crime did mention that there may be some merit to the notion that women are consuming this content to learn how to pick up on warning signs and other survival strategies by looking at cases where women have fought off their attackers or even escaped a kidnapping. I can see this as one of the numerous arguments that people would use to explain why they consume true crime content, and on a surface level, I don't really see much wrong with that. Despite my disdain for the genre, I'm willing to accept that this is a reason that people consume the content. That's not to say that people should rush to cover new and horrific cases and farm views, likes, and the algorithm as things are unfolding though, because that's actually happened before. Creating awareness for things is not inherently good or bad, but sometimes drawing attention to things like famous serial killers and criminals elevates them to a status of celebrity among some corners of the internet. Serial killer fandoms exist online. It's just an ugly truth we have to accept. I'm not going to dive into the reasons they do it, or even give them an inch of sympathy. I simply don't care what they're coping with. I don't care what they're engaged in. Let's move past it, and just keep it in mind. People out there worship mass shooters, serial killers, and the most abhorrent people that have ever walked this earth. We don't need to reckon with it beyond knowing that this is the case. Recently, Netflix released a quote-unquote critically acclaimed Jeffrey Dahmer series, which some of the victims' families have expressed has re-traumatized them and that they've been vocally against the series from the beginning. Serial killer fandoms were elated, and TikTok has actual Jeffrey Dahmer fan cams. Not the character in the portrayal, the actual guy. I think diving into the Dahmer show and analyzing its accuracy and whatnot would be a great waste of everyone's time. The concept that is most relevant to us is the act of glorification. Glorification is the act of describing actions or events as commendable without substantiating why the portrayal is positive in nature. Xanthi Malay, a senior lecturer at the University of Newcastle, comments on the release of a Ted Bundy film called Extremely Wicked and Shockingly Evil and Vile, starring Zac Efron, expressing apprehension at how her students felt affection for Bundy due to the act of playing him, and that maybe this was a reflection of true crime content sort of desensitizing people from the plight of victims affected by the killers being discussed. The idea of glorification is extremely important to understand for true crime content creators, because if you spend a little too long on trauma and a little too long on upbringing, you might be creating a sympathetic sob story for a person who ultimately abandoned all human empathy in their hearts and took their lives and harmed many people. You have to be incredibly careful that your work isn't an accidental celebration of a killer, a piece that changes the narrative from mass murderer to misunderstood boy who was failed by the system. I've seen enough excuses that people make for killers, and as creators we should take care in not accidentally accomplishing the same thing. The last thing you'd want to do as a content creator is reinforce the extremely negative stereotypes surrounding mental illness, poverty, trauma, and make it look like the killer was actually a victim too. Even if there's a tiny hint of truth in there, it is a callous point to make in parallel with the discussion of victims, the impacts on their families and friends. It's the literary equivalent of saying the truth is somewhere in the middle. And yes, things are truly never black or white, but that doesn't mean this is a great way or great avenue to explore that idea, because all you're doing is humanizing a killer, and then you're making them seem like their mental illness was a major reason they did these things, making people that are mentally ill, that aren't killing people or assaulting people, suffer the stigma? Like, let's get serious. The narrative that you present around killers should have a consistent level of messaging that actively condemns the things they do, the things that they did. True crime content creators should actively condemn and have clear messaging around the killer that doesn't depict them as sympathetic individuals. Yes, they may have been abused. Yes, they may have been suffering mental illness. That does not mean you should depict these as large determinants as to why they did this, because all that does is make victims of abuse get stigmatized as future abusers and people with mental illnesses as threats to society. Like, you have to be really clear that them killing people is a result of their own actions. You may try to pathologize the things that they did, but that doesn't change what they did. And trying to explain it away as mental illness or abuse in their upbringing is shirking responsibility from the individual. Not a lot more can be said in that regard. Believe it or not, true crime does actually affect real cases. True crime content can be quite helpful with real cases, especially in the area of reinvigorating cold cases. There's a really famous case in Australia concerning Lynette Dawson that reopened recently due to extreme public pressure from a podcast called The Teacher's Pet. The reopened trial found that the husband was guilty of murder without reasonable doubt based on a number of inconsistencies in his accounts and fabrications that were listed out to him. With the apt amount of public interest and public pressure around injustice, cases can be reopened and reinvestigated, allowing for another attempt for justice to be served. On the contrary, the internet has a really bad track record with misidentifying perpetrators and potentially ruining the lives of innocent people. In 2013, the Boston bomber was incorrectly identified by the internet sleuths on Reddit as Sunil Tripathi. Just because you're guided by some righteous cause, you still have to reckon with the fact that you might irreparably ruin or damage people's lives when you report irresponsibly about potential suspects regarding matters such as unsolved cases or cases that the public want reopened. Jim Ellis, a former FBI agent and licensed private investigator, comments that the problem with a lot of true crime podcasts is that the people hosting them don't understand the rules of evidence. They don't understand the meaning of probable cause, nor the nuances of the criminal investigation where someone's freedom and life are on the line. The lack of care and consideration in potentially ruining lives is a very real reality of the justice system, regardless of how it may help some where it fails others. Sunil's family endured numerous accusations and abuse from the eras of online sleuths and had to endure an abnormal torrent of harassment because Reddit wanted to play detective and actually bogged down the actual law enforcement's ability to research the actual perpetrators. This was nothing more than a witch hunt and a clear demonstration of the ugliest consequence of irresponsible investigating and research. With that in mind, some say that the true crime genre brings attention to these cases and gives people a glimpse into the lives taken by horrible killers. And I can concede that that's true, but that's not a strong enough reason to justify the existence of a lot of true crime content that exists out there. How is whispering into a binaural microphone about atrocity bringing awareness to a case that's already solved? How is eating chicken and talking about serial killers informing the public of some supposed valuable information you're imparting to them? How is doing makeup and having a chat about an atrocity, taking care in respectfully covering the lives taken? And how should the family and friends of the victim feel when they see it? Most of all, is making jokes and quips really enough to justify how a lot of creators directly pocket the money made from covering this content? Hey guys, before I cover this mass murderer who took 26 people's lives, I'd like to shout out this company, or VPN, or this boldness company, or this food company. You know how bizarre that sounds? Be serious. So where are we at? Well, I'd say that you should be careful with your approach and the format you use to present the information you're presenting, because your content is likely to be seen by the victim's friends and family if you have any sizable reach. You should also be conscientious of the fact that any creative liberties you take can offend the affected parties. I'm not saying that this is a compelling enough reason to stop making this content, but that your continued content creation should be conscious of drawing a clear line in the sand, like not making jokes about how the victim is killed or blaming the victim for being duped at the very least. Spreading awareness does factor into the reason that true crime is so popular, but you should still take great pains to be clear with your messaging and actively condemn the killer. You don't want to accidentally glamorize the life of a killer while disrespecting the victims. Take care in how you write about killers, because you might accidentally depict them as sympathetic and misunderstood individuals, creating a narrative that completely tramples upon the graves of the victims. And finally, true crime can be good. It can be used to raise public awareness and interest in cold cases. It can also add public pressure to reopen cases that were not conducted with enough care. It's a slippery slope, as many podcasts and YouTube creators may run into the same pitfalls where Reddit did, where identifying suspects and giving inadmissible evidence and speculation can actually ruin an innocent person's life. In the end, I still watch some true crime videos to pass the time, but I wonder, is it normalized because it's actually worthwhile? Or because we all subscribe to this moral trade-off where we put aside the feelings of the victims' family and friends, just so we can have something to chew on, something to consume? Is our desire for consumption something that really outweighs the trauma of those people? I don't know. And even if you don't stop making true crime videos and documentaries tomorrow, it's still worth interrogating how ethical it is to make money off of their trauma. Maybe at the end of this, you're still gonna go watch more true crime content, and I welcome you to do that. I'm not here to think for you. But at the very least, try and sift through the garbage so that victims aren't blatantly being disrespected while some surface level analysis is being given while accompanied by some ASMR or somebody eating chicken. That's all I can really ask. And if even one person feels a little bit more critical of the genre without fully abandoning it, then I'd say that I accomplished what I set out to do. I hope that you can find content that is respectful, informative, and isn't straight up exploitative, making money off the death of others. Hey guys, it's my second ever video. It took a little longer to make than I was hoping because I was actually writing 2 videos at the same time, but I realized that the scope of this was a lot larger than I anticipated. I'm gonna put another video out by the end of October. It's likely gonna be about paranormal stuff. But yeah, I hope that the audio levels and things like that were a lot better this time around, and if you have any feedback or you didn't like the style of presentation, let me know in the comments below. I'm thinking about trying to dial back the formal speech and trying to be a little more casual, not because I don't like speaking in formal speech, but often when I'm talking, I do talk in a way that is generally more clear and concise, but when I write essays, I use bigger words and whatnot, so I don't know. If you have any issues with the way I present, let me know. I'll take the feedback on board and I'll incorporate it into my next one. Take it easy. Bye.